Well, I want to thank you for joining me for part 2 of our series called Face Forward. We're in the letter of James, and this series to me is so vital for many of us today. Look, I heard a long time ago from a teacher of mine. She said you can look up for inspiration, look down in desperation, look left to right for information, which, to be honest with you, I did sometimes. But the reality is God wants us to learn how to walk. He wants us to learn how to face forward. He wants us to learn how to live, right? I mean, so many of us, we go through our lives every single day and we're just battling, and it's like, man, I'm looking up, I'm looking down, I'm looking left, see what my neighbors are doing. I'm trying to compete with them and live with them, and it's like at times I just find myself with my head down, and I'm in this depressed state, and it's like, man, how do I get out of this, and how do I move forward? And the great thing about the letter of James is that he's writing to a group of people who have been dispersed. They've been kicked out of their homes. They've been like literally kind of like pushed out and abandoned. And I don't know if you remember that time when you were probably 17, 18 years old and you headed off to college and you came back home and, you know, mom and dad had sold your bed and basically turned your room into like a scrapbooking room, and you're like, man, I don't have a place to lay my head anymore. I'm literally on my own. Well, imagine that, but like 100 times worse. The people that James is writing to have been completely abandoned, completely pushed out, completely humiliated. They've experienced poverty and extreme abuse, and now it's like James finds this audience of what he calls the tribes, but he also calls them his brothers and sisters, like his family, his own flesh and blood. He looks at them and he just, with all humility, you know, says, look guys, you gotta stop looking down in desperation. You gotta stop trying to look left or right and comparing yourself to your neighbors, or just trying to, like, you know, get ahead of the person that, you know, should be your brother or your sister. Like, stop all this competing. He says, look, you got to learn how to live. And so he starts off this letter by calling himself a servant. That's how James decides he's living life, as a humble servant to God our Father and his own brother, Jesus Christ. And then in verses 2, 3, and 4, he says something that honestly, if you hear nothing through this entire series, I pray you memorize James 2, 3, and 4. He says, consider it pure joy, my friends, my brothers, my sisters, when you face trials of many kinds. It's almost like one of those sentences where someone says, consider it pure joy, and then he hits this pause button by saying, my brothers and sisters, so it like allows our brains to catch up with what he's saying. And you're like, okay, what do I consider, you know, pure joy? What do I consider a good thing? Let's just use really basic terms here. Many of us would say full-time job, you know, lots of money, the nice car, the nice house, lots of respect, you know, from my friends, my neighbors, feeling like my husband loves me, feeling like my wife respects me, all those like base level things that we all desire. But James doesn't talk about any of that. Matter of fact, this is how you know the Bible is real, okay? Because he opens up by talking about trials. See, the scriptures and the authors of the New Testament don't avoid the hard things. They're not out to write to tell us, like, look, yeah, consider it pure joy when you get that big check. Consider it pure joy when your kids are healthy. Consider it pure joy when everyone loves you and cheers your name. No, he says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters. Are you ready for this? When you face trials, which we all can relate to. Those times where we look down in desperation, up for inspiration, or left to right for information, right? Like those are times that are real. And James says to us, like, look, I get what it's like to follow God and pursue him with all your heart and your mind and your soul and your strength and trying to love your neighbor as yourself. I get that. And at the same time, you still face trials. If you don't know this yet, the letter of James is heavily influenced by Proverbs chapters 1 through 9. It's also influenced by the Sermon on the Mount. James was the half-brother of Jesus, and he really listened to what his brother said. And so when he tells us to consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of various kinds, because those trials produce endurance or perseverance, and perseverance, when it's fully, worked out, it creates this perfection, this maturity. Some of your translations will say this completeness. right? James has a vision here for us to grow spiritually, and not so much grow in the physical possessions of this world, and not so much to grow like in gaining things. He wants us to grow in our perspective that trials are those things that are actually being used by God to help us to become perfect or complete, to help us to mature as believers. And so he says, listen, you need to really change your mindset here about how you think about trials. Don't look at them as destructive. Look at them as constructive, as good things. When they come your way, like, you got to be like, thank you, Lord, that you've brought this trial into my life. Now I get to lean into you, and I know the result of this is going to be a maturity, a completeness, a perfection that I myself was lacking. And now I know that you love me because you brought this in my life, you allowed this to happen, and I'm just going to get a chance to lean into you. And so in James chapter 1, James brings up like 4 solid trials here. He's going to talk about the lacking of wisdom. He's going to talk about the lack of wealth or possessions. And then he's going to jump into temptation. And then he's going to kind of wrap all this up by talking about anger. And the neat thing about James chapter 1 is sometimes when we read through chapter 1, it almost seems like you're reading through the Proverbs. It seems like he just jumps from topic to topic, but actually he's just going back and trying to support his opening statement in verses 2 through 4. He's just giving us examples of trials that, everyone faces on a regular basis. Like in verse 5, he's going to talk about this idea of if you lack wisdom, he says you need to ask God, and then he adds this caveat, like you need to have faith when you ask God. Because if you don't trust him, and you don't know what you're doing, and you don't know where you're going, like this idea of wisdom is a very Jewish term, right? It's the idea of learning to live life skillfully in the presence of the Lord. So, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, and acknowledge him in all your ways, and what will he do? He will direct your path. So the person who doesn't know their path, they lack wisdom, they don't know where to go, what do we often do? When that trial comes our way, when we lose our job, when we go through that divorce, when we lose our house, when we, our kids are a mess, when, our kids are hooked up on drugs or whatever it may be that we're facing, and we're going, God, I don't have the skill to live this particular part of life right now. What does he tell us to do in James chapter 1? He says, look, you've got to learn to lean into God and ask God for help. He wants to help you. Do you trust him? And it's like, man, I don't know if I can trust God. I've been able to trust myself so many times, and yet right now I feel like I'm getting tossed around like a ship out in water. It's just getting blown back and forth. And now you're asking me to take this big step and just trust and lean on God in the midst of this terrible situation. James says, yes, it's exactly what I'm asking you to do, because the result is you're going to blossom like a flower. You're going to come to this maturity, and you're going to come to this deeper understanding, and it's going to be fantastic, not just for your life. It's not like your life is going to get easier, a person who's been dispersed. What he's saying is like, look, you particularly are going to grow as a result of this. And so he leaves wisdom, lacking of wisdom. He jumps right into like a very base thing of like wealth. And he simply says like, look, if your goal in life is to pursue wealth, like that'll come and go. It's never going to be as stable and as secure as you think it's going to be. It'll drop out like that, And he says you can't control it. You shouldn't certainly look towards that as being your security. Because here's the thing, think about this for a second. When we lack wisdom, right? There's a understanding that we don't have. There's a skill that we're incomplete with, right? But when we lack wealth, the reason why many of us want wealth is because it helps make our lives comfortable. And so when your life isn't comfortable, think of this audience, right? They've been dispersed, they've been kicked out, they've been abandoned, they've been stripped of everything that gave them, security in life. James is saying, look, as quickly as that was taken from you, the rich people you see around you, it can be taken from them. And so if that trial of poverty is something you're facing right now, let me help you to learn how to walk through that. And so James encourages his audience of how to face the trial of poverty. He says, look, don't look at it as a bad thing. Look at it as a thing that God has brought in your life so that you can become mature, you can become complete. Years ago, my wife and I were meeting with friends of mine that I graduated from school with. They're a wonderful couple. They were doing youth ministry in Pennsylvania, and so we decided we would drive an hour, they would drive an hour, and we'd just talk. And it was one of those conversations I don't think I was prepared for. You know, I've been in ministry now for 9 years, and they had been in ministry about the same amount of time. And when we met with them, I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm not in the ministry anymore. And I said, well, what happened? He says, well, I was accused of something. And I said, like, can you go into detail? And he said, probably not good that I would go into detail. And I said, that's okay. I said, well, what transpired? He goes, well, I was accused, but then they found out that everything was not true, what I was accused of. I said, well, that's good. He goes, well, it really wasn't. He goes, they'd already fired me from the job. And then every time I tried to apply at a different congregation, people that weren't in on the original meetings would write letters to these various churches and tell them that all these horrible things that just weren't true about me. And he goes, you know, it just got to the point where I just got so discouraged and so put down that, you know, I just stopped applying at churches. And he goes, so now I'm not working anymore in a church. And I said, oh my goodness. And this went on for an hour of them describing some of the terrible things that people have done and said to them that weren't true. It was all based on gossip. It was all just based on people not taking the time to, you know, research and figure out what exactly happened in a scenario. And what I remember is we were done and we had finished up and dinner was paid for, and then we were heading out to the driveway, and I said, you know, how do you guys look at your situation right now in the scope of Scripture? I said, you know, we went to school together and we did a lot of ministry together before we all branched off and went our separate ways. And I said, what do you guys do? And I'll tell you, I'll never forget this. His wife turns around. She was heading out, had their child in her arms, and she looks at Jen and I, and she quotes James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. And she says, Paul, we are considering this pure joy right now. And it just stopped me in my tracks. And then she followed it up by saying, look, God has brought this into our life because there's something that we are lacking, and this is our opportunity to lean into Him and to trust Him, even when none of this makes sense. And I just thought that moment, like, oh my goodness, I want to be like that. I want to have that kind of perspective. I want to be able to face trials the way you guys face trials. And so James encourages all of us, actually. He says, look, when you face trials of many kinds, don't look at it as a terrible thing. Look at it as a good thing. Look at it as a thing they consider as pure joy. Better than gold, better than silver, better than anything of this world. Look at it as something that is just so precious because you know God is doing a good work in your heart. And then he actually stops in these examples that he's been giving, because he just gave us two in verses 5 through 8. He talked about lacking of wisdom, and then 9 through 11 he talks about this idea of wealth. And then in verse 12 he just pauses, right? And this is what James says in verse 12 about our trials. He brings up this idea of trials again, and then he just like reminds his audience, much like he reminds us. He says, look, you know, if you're facing a trial right now, you've got to be willing to just lean into it a little harder and a little longer, because look, at the end of this, there is this crown of life that God has promised. And then he adds this phrase, which I think is so interesting, and it's there in the Greek as well. He says, for those who love him. And you're thinking, man, God, like, I can love you when things are going really well, and I can love you when the stock market is up, and I can love you when, you know, the person I voted for wins, and I can love you when my kids get those good grades, and I can love you, God, when the car runs, and I can love you, God, when the paperwork came through for that loan we applied for, and God, I can love you when, you know, my dog isn't sick, and God, I can love you when the furnace doesn't break. But in the midst of all this right now, I don't think I can actually love you. And it's almost like James reminds us, like, look, lean in, because there is this crown of life that comes at the very end for those who love him. This is the time to look, to say, God, I love you, and I'm going to, as a result, obey you. And then he picks up his third example, talks to us about temptation, which I think is something that all of us can relate to if we don't lack wisdom or we, don't have, poverty to deal with. James says, look, temptation. And the first thing he tells us in this idea of temptation is he says, look, when you face temptation, don't blame God. This is not the time for you to put the blame on God. Matter of fact, James puts the onus on us. He says it's from you. It's from your own desire. It's from your own deceitfulness, right? James implores, he says, look, this is not something God brought into your life. There are trials that come, but then there's this trial of temptation, and you can't look and blame God and shake your fist at him and say, I can't believe, you're allowing me to be tempted right now. And really the emphasis here is on a moral temptation. He says, look, that's from your own heart. It's from your own deceitfulness. And he goes, the problem here is temptation is not an event. It's a process that you've allowed to happen in your life. He goes, look, it started with you. And then it transitioned into a sin. And then that sin gave birth, and it gave birth to death. James says, look, it started with you, and then you decided to just continue to eat that and take hold of that, and it produced this sin, and you thought it was going to produce life and joy and peace and all these wonderful things. And then when it was finally born, it's actually a pretty gruesome kind of description James gives us, because you think it's going to birth new life and happiness and love, and when it's born, it's just dead. It's no longer living. It no longer gave you that satisfaction that you thought it was going to give you. And you think of so many of us that get caught up in sexual sin continually in our life and throughout our life. And we never lean in to say, God, can you help me in the midst of what I'm wrestling with, in the midst of what I'm going to? No, we just hide, and we think, you know what, as long as I keep this locked away, it's eventually going to work itself out, and it's eventually going to produce like this good thing, and it's going to produce this life, and it's going to make me happy, and it's going to make me fulfilled and satisfied. And God the entire time is saying, look, that is going to end up in death. It's not something to tinker around with. And so James reminds us, like, look, when it comes to temptation, particularly temptation, don't blame God. That is from you. It's like that scene in Genesis 1 where Genesis 2 and 3, right, where Adam's caught red-handed, and he says, man, it's her fault. The woman you gave me. And God's like, no, it's not her fault. It was your choice. You decided to take this step. And when you took this step, it gave birth to sin. And now the result of it is death. Sin always leads to death. It's not something that produces life. It's not something that produces joy. It's something that produces death. And so, like, in the midst of our temptations, what does James reminds us? He reminds us continually, look, you cannot blame God when you're tempted. You cannot say it's his fault. What you need to do is you need to look to the truth. You need to seek the truth. You need to run after the truth. You need to pursue truth. Don't be deceived, he tells us. Don't blame God, and then don't be deceived. You need to continually seek after the truth, because the truth is that one thing that's going to set us free. It's going to turn on the light. It's going to allow us not to look left and right or down or up, but it's going to allow us to walk and to live and to know how to respond when the trials come in our lives, whether it's lacking wisdom or lacking funds or that comfortable living, right? Or just having these constant temptations in our lives. And then he kind of wraps all this up by talking about the trial of anger. The trial of anger, and we're going to try to jump into this a little bit more next week, but really he wraps it up by saying, like, look, you need to be what? It's almost like this hand exercise, because you need to be slow to anger, but you need to be quick to listen, slow to speak, right? But quick to listen, slow to become angry, but quick to listen. And there's this idea there where it's like, man, what are we listening to? Are we going to listen to the things of this world, what our neighbors are saying? What are we going to listen to what ourselves are saying? I hope not. Are we going to open up the word of truth and listen to what God is saying to us, what God is teaching to us, what God wants us to know and to have, which is like so awesome that James would say this. Because James, out of all the persons of this earth, came to faith in his brother as the Messiah, as his resurrected Lord after the resurrection. And so James is saying, look, I tried it all these other ways, and then I saw that my brother really was God in the flesh, rose from the dead, and it's it gave me new life. I knew I could listen to his words, and I knew it would bring life. And guys, I've lived this out, and it brings life. So look, don't be quick to jump into anger. When that thing comes into your life, when that trial comes in your life, he's saying look, you need to recognize it, and you need to respond by running and listening to the Lord and what the Lord has to say. And I love how he wraps this all up. He says, listen, don't just be, hearers of the word, but do what it says. And the whole time you got to be running through in your mind, as James is saying this, James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Because you know that this trial that's in your life, if you persevere through it, that perseverance is going to create a maturity. There's a picture that hangs up in my office every day. It's right next to my desk. I wrote this down years ago because I was reading through Walter Brueggemann's book on the Psalms, and Brueggemann talks about this cycle that we have in the Christian life, and he actually refers to James, the letter of James, when he writes this, but he's referencing the Psalms. He talks about the idea that, listen, what we seek so much in our life is what is called equilibrium. We want balance. We want everything to be as it should be. And the reality is God doesn't want us to be settled. God doesn't want us to be settled in ourselves and settled in this world. No, he has a home for us in heaven, and he wants to push us. And so it's we will be thrown into disequilibrium. Not always by God. The trials of this world often do it for us. The storms of this life, right? We're going to lack wisdom in a situation. We're going to not have enough money because, things aren't going to always work out the way financially that we thought they would be. There's going to be a temptation that's going to come. We're going to have a situation where we can be angry, and that's going to throw us out of equilibrium. It's going to throw us into disorientation. And when we're in disorientation, we have a choice there. Do we want to lean into God and ask him for help and seek God, or do we want to blame God? Do we want to say, God, it's your fault that I'm in this situation. Had you not, had you been there, I would have been able to make it through. See, I believe that when we're in this disoriented state, that if we lean and trust God, we will have a new orientation, a new perspective, but not of ourselves, not of this world, but of God. I think that's part of what James is getting at here. He's telling us as believers, look at trials as pure joy. Because you and I, we seek balance, we seek equilibrium, we seek all these, standard things, right? Because we want everything in order. And it's when things get thrown out of order, that's an opportunity for you and I to have a new perspective, not of this world, not of just of ourselves, but listen, of who God is. We'll be to hear from God for the very first time as if we haven't ever heard from him. We'll be to see God working in our lives as if we never seen him work. And it's man, I didn't know you said that. I didn't know you were capable of doing those kinds of things. And the entire time James is saying look, when you're going through a trial, consider it pure joy, because there's going to be this completeness and this maturity that's going to come, and you're going to start seeing and hearing God as if you've never seen and heard him in this way. And he's going to show up and he's going to do some amazing things in your life. So look, I want to encourage you today. Whatever you're facing, whatever you're going through, consider it pure joy. Because that trial that's in your life right now, that's going to produce a maturity in you. And the end result is you're going to have this new perspective of who God is. And you're going to be able to worship him as the one and true living God who created you and wants to give you life to the fullness. Listen, I hope you're with us next week for part 3 of our series in James.